London, 1836. Caroline Norton walked out of her house with nothing but the clothes on her back. Her husband, George, a barrister, a man of standing, had been beating her for years. The servants knew, their friends knew, her own family knew. She left anyway. She took her 3 boys with her. George came the next morning and took the children back. By law, they were entirely his. Not subject to negotiation, entirely, unconditionally his. Caroline had no legal standing to object. Under English law, a married woman had no separate legal existence. She had left her husband. And that, as far as the law was concerned, was the crime. Leaving destabilized ownership. She fought for years, wrote pamphlets, petitioned Parliament. Then her youngest son fell ill while she was still fighting for the right to visit him. She wasn't there when he died. She lost her child because she left her husband, not because she was unfit, because she left. George Norton was never charged with anything. He was the wronged party, by the court's logic. She was the one who had walked out the door. And here is the question that this story opens. Not why the law was so cruel, but why leaving was considered the offence. Caroline's case was not unusual. It was unusual only in that she wrote about it, which meant history preserved her name while the others dissolved into silence. To understand why divorce carried such devastating consequences, you have to first understand what marriage actually was. Not sentimentally, but structurally. For most of human history, marriage was not primarily about love or compatibility. It was an economic and political architecture. It transferred property, secured alliances, established lines of inheritance, and defined every person's place in the social order. Without it, you weren't just alone, you were categorically unplaced. And an unplaced person in a rigidly ordered society is a problem the society doesn't know how to integrate. When a society cannot integrate something, it protects itself by exclusion. In England before 1857, a formal divorce required a private act of Parliament. Over the entire 18th century, roughly 300 such divorces were granted, across a country of millions over 100 years. This was not an oversight, it was a design feature. Divorce was meant to be functionally impossible, and it was. But the most interesting thing is not the legal barrier. Legal barriers can be dismantled. What kept the system in place far longer than the laws themselves was something more durable. The social cost of leaving was made so catastrophically high that most people never tried. Let's look at how this actually worked, not as a list of injustices, but as a functioning system with its own internal logic. The first layer was economic, and it was total. When a woman married, everything she owned, her dowry, her inheritance, any money she earned, legally became her husband's property. Not shared, his. If she left with nothing because nothing was hers to take. For a working-class woman, survival without a husband meant poverty. For a woman of the middle or upper classes, it was in some ways worse. The social prohibition against respectable women working meant she had no mechanism to support herself at all. The higher her social position, the narrower her exit options. Privilege and entrapment were often the same condition. The second layer was the children. Until the late 19th century, children in England belonged to their father. automatically, legally, without question. A mother who left didn't just leave her husband. She left her children permanently. This single fact kept more women inside bad marriages than any law or social custom ever could, because the threat wasn't abstract, it was specific, and it was guaranteed. The third layer was the one that outlasted all the laws, the social layer. And this is where the mechanism becomes genuinely fascinating, because it didn't require any central authority to enforce it. It enforced itself. A divorced woman in the 19th century was not merely judged. She was functionally removed from the networks that made life possible. Doors that had been open closed quietly, without explanation. In an era when professional opportunities, housing, your children's marriage prospects, and your son's career advancement all flowed through personal connections and social reputation, exclusion from those networks was not an embarrassment, it was an existential sentence. And the system was self-perpetuating. Women who stayed in unhappy marriages taught their daughters to stay, not out of cruelty, but out of love, out of an accurate understanding of what the alternative actually cost. The fear passed down through generations not as oppression, but as wisdom. Because in the world those women inhabited, it was wisdom. What I find most striking about all of this is that it didn't require people to be monstrous. The neighbors who withdrew, the employers who refused, the judges who ruled, most were not acting from malice. They were maintaining the structure they genuinely believed was holding civilization together. And in a sense, they were right. The structure did hold together. It just held together on the backs of the people trapped inside it. Stability is often mistaken for morality. But they are not the same thing. 2019. Not London, Moscow, or Istanbul, or Warsaw. It doesn't particularly matter. 8 years of marriage, a husband who doesn't hit, he manages. Money flows through him, he checks the phone. Work isn't necessary, he provides. Certain friends have gradually become the wrong kind. Legally, she is free. Divorce is accessible. Property is divided. The courts exist. But she does the calculation. If she leaves, her mother will say the marriage should have been preserved. Her mother-in-law will fight for the grandchildren, not out of malice, but out of genuine conviction. The wives of her husband's colleagues will stop returning her messages, not because they hate her, but because distance is safer for them. She hasn't worked in 3 years. Her resume is outdated. Her confidence too. No one will strip her rights officially, but the cost of leaving is still high enough to delay, high enough to intimidate. The law had changed. The social perimeter had not. What was once encoded in statutes is now dissolved into expectations. Instead of the law knows no such person as a wife, you made your choice. Instead of a parliamentary act, quiet exclusion. Instead of a formal verdict, the slow withdrawal of the people around you. Different century, different city, the same calculation. And even now, when custody battles do reach courts, they tend to reveal an asymmetry, not of law, but of assumption. We expect the mother to absorb the disruption. We assume the father can reconfigure his life more freely. The structure has shifted. The burden distribution often has not. The easy conclusion from all of this is that people in the past were cruel, and that we've grown kinder. That's not quite right, and it misses the more interesting point. The problem was never that people were uniquely heartless. Most of them were behaving rationally within the system they'd been given. The problem was that the system had been constructed deliberately over centuries to make leaving more expensive than staying. And when leaving is more expensive than staying, people stay. Not because they are weak, because they are doing arithmetic. Divorce stopped meaning social death not because people became more compassionate, though perhaps they did. It stopped when the price changed. When women gained the legal right to own property, England, 1882, when courts began granting custody based on a child's welfare rather than a father's ownership, when women entered the paid workforce in large enough numbers that economic independence became possible, when no-fault divorce was introduced, California, 1969, the United Kingdom, remarkably, not until 2020. Each of those changes didn't make people braver, they made the exit cheaper. And once the exit became affordable, people began to use it. Every reform adjusted the equation, none of them eliminated it. This was never a story about courage. It was a story about pricing. Caroline Norton never lived to see what she spent her life fighting for. The Custody of Infants Act passed in 1839, a small partial concession allowing mothers limited rights to children under 7. The Married Women's Property Act, which finally permitted a woman to own something in her own name, passed in 1882. Caroline Norton died in 1877. 5 years too soon. She fought for rights she didn't live to use. Someone else used them. There is a structural pattern in that. Every freedom that now seems obvious was, at some earlier point, something a specific person paid too much for. Personally, immediately, without seeing the outcome. They paid so the next person would pay a little less. History doesn't soften, it recalculates. Which leaves the only question worth sitting with after all of this. What structures today still survive, not because people believe in them, but because the exit remains too expensive? I don't think any of us can answer that fully. We're usually too close to the thing we're inside to price it accurately. But someone, somewhere, is paying right now to bring that cost down. Someone they will never meet.